Right, good morning, everyone. I'd just like to thank the organisers for having me here today. This is a wonderful exercise, and I'm really honoured to be a part of it. As Zoe said, my name is Samantha. Please call me Sam. I'm an associate at Smith & Lawville in Summers. I realize that discussing the legal aspects of biodiversity doesn't quite lend itself to an interesting or creative, pretty PowerPoint presentation, but I have made an effort to try and pretty it up and make it a little bit stimulating. That being said, I do not think that it's really necessary to go into the details of the legal introduction into protected environments and protected areas. I think we're all pretty familiar with the types and the processes. What I'd like to discuss today is the effectiveness of protected areas, and specifically in terms of mining applications in South Africa, and whether these proclaimed or declared protected areas are having the desired outcome. Just before we get into the interesting case studies, it's important that we just discuss a few aspects which will sort of be a golden thread throughout my presentation today. The first thing is, why is it important to legally proclaim or declare an area as protected? And this is has a twofold answer. The first is obviously an ecological benefit, in that protected areas are managed under approved management plans and in accordance with best practice. The second one is, legally it's important to declare these areas. And this has got a plethora of benefits. The first being that in all protected areas declared, there's an added layer of protection from the outset. So, and this is sort of manifested in the protected areas register or the database. Essentially, it's a map of South Africa overlaid with the delineated coordinates of each protected area. So for project proponents, when they're looking for an area where they'd like to mine or have a wind energy facility or whatever project, they can see from the onset that their coordinates overlap with the protected area. It may be aligned with such protected area land uses, and it may not be, for example, like mining. The second legal benefit is that there are incentives for landowners, such as SARS tax rebates, as well as an exemption from municipal rates, which is really a good initiative for landowners who are owning areas with biodiversity, with high biodiversity. Additionally, in some cases, we have, in most cases where we've got private land, there are challenges, and this is moving on to the next table, the next square there, where there are benefits, but the challenges with dealing with government officials or with private landowners is that it's not a swift process. And the longer the process is dragged out, the longer the land remains vulnerable. And this is what's going to take me to the next section, discussing minerals, and why I'm going to focus on this in my presentation today. Minerals and mining is quite unique in South Africa when you compare it to an ordinary EIA. An ordinary EIA development requires landowners' consent, but the relationship with mining is that the state owns the mineral and gives authorization to the mining company. As a landowner, you obviously do have a role to play, but at the end of the day, you can't say you can't come on my land. That is not a requirement as part of the mining EIA process. So what is important to understand going forward is that the mining application process involves a mining right as well as an environmental authorization. Although these processes are done as almost one process, it's important to distinguish that the first part of the application involves the application for a mining right. Now that is accepted or rejected by DMR. That will involve the DMR looking at whether there are mineral reserves in the area that's applied for, and whether it falls over, for example, a protected area. In other words, the DMR should reject an application falling over a nature reserve, because no mining may commence in a nature reserve. There's no reason then to allow the application to take any further steps, because it will not be successful under any conditions. So Considering the amount of work that goes into getting these areas proclaimed and declared, are they really having the desired effectiveness? And I'd like to just briefly touch on DMR, being the authority that's now going to be managing EIA applications, as well as what they previously managed being the mining right application. There's a little bit of controversy with the introduction of the one environmental system, namely that the DMR being the only authority in South Africa that's permitted to assess and approve or process and reject a EIA application. For example, if the Department of Roads and Transport would like to build a road, their application goes to the Department of Environmental Affairs. Similarly, with every other organ of state application, except for the DMR. So there has been some controversy around it. And the other controversial aspect is that whether they have a conflict of interest. The DMR is mandated to exploit mineral resources, not to conserve the environment. So my question is, do the DMR or does the DMR consult this protected areas register before they approve and accept mining applications? I've touched briefly on the landowner's consent aspect. It's just something to bear in mind. But the point is that we rely a lot on DMR upholding the protected areas and not allowing processes such as a mining right to commence and the EIA to start if it's in a nature reserve or somewhere where it cannot yield a positive decision. I don't want you to be nervous about this very legal slide. I want it to be up there so you have access to the actual legislation. In summary, Section 48 of NEMPA and Section 48 of the MPRDA, ironically they're the same number, I don't know how that happened, but what they say, what NEMPA says, is that a nature reserve, a special nature reserve, a national park, a marine protected area, forests, specific forests are declared under the National Forestry Act, and I think that's it, is no mining may occur in those areas regardless. There is absolutely no provision for mining. However, in a protected environment, mining may commence provided the Minister of Environmental Affairs as well as the Minister of DMR have provided their written consent. Now, this isn't the DMR and DIA, this is the ministers must provide their consent. And this is, the first case study I'm going to discuss really focuses on this written approval relating to protected environments. And I'm sure you've all heard of it, the Mabola Protected Environment and Aether Africa's Ventures application for a mining right, which overlapped with a certain portion of the Mabola Protected Environment. Now, in 2013, there was an intention to declare the Mabola Protected Environment, and in 2014, in January, they declared it as a protected environment. Later on in that year, in May, the Department of Environmental Affairs, being the competent authority before the One Environmental System came into effect, rejected the application, the environmental authorization application, on the basis of conservation concerns, but also because that written approval from both ministers had not been obtained. Nonetheless, DMR progressed to award the mining right 4 months later to Aether Africa. So this is a perfect example of where the DMR just does not consult any other organs of state, let alone our protected areas database or register, however you like to pronounce it, and simply goes ahead. But this is before the One Environmental System. We're going to look a bit later as to, given their new authority, oversight of everything, are they considering protected environments now? Just one note is that this is a particularly complex matter, and it has become very litigious. The written authorizations in terms of Section 48 that weren't obtained have subsequently been obtained, and this is the subject of another court approach and an interdict. I think CR has taken the lead on that, but there is a coalition of entities, just something to bear in mind going forward. The second case study involves Barberton Mines and the Barberton Mountain land, which I'm sure you've all heard of as well. Barberton Mines was awarded a prospecting right in 2006. A prospecting right is only valid for 5 years. So naturally, they applied for a full mining right in 2011. However, the landowners, being the Mpumalanga Tourism and Parks Association, as well as the Barberton Mountain Landowners Association, denied access to the miners, to Barberton Mines, as provided that the area was actually a nature reserve. Now, it hadn't been declared in terms of NEMA as a nature reserve, NEMPA in terms of a nature reserve. But, and so Barberton Mines took these landowners to court to get an interdict to stop them from denying them access. A High Court upheld this and said it wasn't a nature reserve. This was taken to the Supreme Court of Appeal, where the Supreme Court of Appeal actually upheld that it was a nature reserve for, albeit called something else. And those three declarations in terms of former legislation was relied on by the Supreme Court of Appeal in their findings that it has conservation value, and the mechanisms at the time did declare it as an area requiring protection. It's interesting to note that Barberton Mines therefore went to appeal to the Constitutional Court, and that was refused in August this year, which is a really good finding. The lesson to be taken from here is that historical protected areas trump mining rights, even if they were declared in legislation prior to NEMPA. The next one is the Mpumalanga National Park and Cultural Landscape. This is a proximity case study or a buffer zone case study. Now, we have discussed that nature reserves, there is absolutely no provision that allows something like mining, exploration, production, prospecting in these nature reserves. However, you are allowed it, or there's nothing to say you can't do it in the buffer zone. So the Valley Colliery was approved or given a mining right in 2009. This Valley Colliery, if it was to be in its full lifespan, would come within 5 kilometers of the Mpumalanga, the Mapungubwe cultural landscape. So my question is, does the DMR have to, ignoring the fact that they haven't considered protected areas themselves, but should it not be something that a buffer zone forms a consideration? Buffer zones play a very important role. For example, you cannot have a freight train going past the Isimangaliso Wetland Park because absolutely no animals will be in a radius of I don't know how many kilometers, but it defeats the purpose of that area. So why do they allow something like mining in the buffer zone? And this is important because South Africa also has a buffer zone strategy, which specifically says that activities such as mining should not fall within a buffer zone. It's interesting because the strategy also says that buffer zones are a special area in terms of NEMA section 24(2)(b), which says if you'd like to develop in those areas, you need an environmental authorization. It's not clear whether they actually declare mining as an activity requiring that, because mining would require an EA anyway. And we'll discuss that a bit later. But my point is that buffer zones are as important to conserve from mining as the protected area. And nonetheless, the DMR simply rubber stamp and approve and accept these applications. The final case study is something a bit closer to home for the shark supporters, and that's the Fuleni mine application. The application has since lapsed, but the lesson we can take from it is that the DMR, regardless, accepts applications for mining inside the buffer zone. It's on the direct border of the Hluhluwe Mpolozi Park. It's a beautiful area. It's our oldest declared protected area, and it's just unacceptable that this isn't rejected from the outset. I've just squeezed in one comment here, and that is something a bit more contemporary. These exploration rights that have been applied for throughout South Africa all started with the scope, and I'm not sure if it's very clear in this picture, I apologize, but inside that red circle is the dotted line of the original scope of the application for exploration. And that original scope included all the nature reserves, national parks, and DMR simply accepted this. And this is after the one environmental system. So my question is, again, does DMR totally disregard this protected areas database? It is so easy to have a look, to delineate, put your coordinates in, but the question remains is DMR simply accepting anything? All right, I'd like to just discuss a few solutions. The first is that the declaration process is complicated. It is long, and it is dealing with a multitude of different parties, each with different interests. What's important going forward is knowing the process, being familiar with the steps. The longer the area remains unprotected, the more chance there is of landowners changing their mind, property being sold, subdivided, consolidated, changing, you name it. It just puts it at risk. So having a sound declaration or proclamation process is very important. An efficient and up-to-date protected areas database, as well as the screening tool. The screening tool is proposed to be introduced in April next year. And the screening tool is very important because the regulations say that a snapshot of the screening tool must be attached to your application for environmental authorization. This will have an overlaid protected area database map as well. So from the beginning, DMR can see whether any mining right applications fall over a protected area. Section 49 of the MPRDA and Section 24.2a of NEMA are relatively similar in that it empowers the Ministers of Environment and Minister of Mineral Resources to declare areas as no-go zones. I personally think it is a good idea to declare buffer zones as a no-go zone. The protected area is nonetheless a no-go zone, regardless of whether these two mechanisms are used by virtue of Section 48 of NEMPA. But it would be a progressive step from the department to protect those buffer zones as well. Finally, if those two don't work, there is the option of specifying that no mining activities may be conducted in the buffer zone as per that Section 24.2b, which is a little bit vague at this stage. And finally, what is important is the participation from provincial conservation boards as bodies mandated to facilitate the conservation of the province from the start of every mining application which affects a protected area. Are there any questions? Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for that.
Sure.
Is gas a mineral resource?